The Boy Who Lost His Face by Louis Sachar. 10. David spent too long in the shower thinking about Miss Williams, what she said to him and the way she smiled. He could still picture her with her green headband, her blue shorts, and her red high-top sneakers. He felt a sudden pang of remorse as he remembered that Mrs. Bayfield was wearing red high-top sneakers too. The bell rang while he was getting dressed. He hurriedly tied his shoes, stuffed his gym clothes into his locker, and headed for Spanish class. His last class of the day. Buenos tardes, David, Mrs. Gutierrez greeted him as he walked in late. Buenos tardes, senora, he replied. He was struck by the fact that in Spanish tardes means afternoon, whereas in English tardy means late. Even though Mrs. Gutierrez said good afternoon to him, he had a feeling that in her own way, she was also telling him he was late. David, Mrs. Gutierrez whispered sharply. She wriggled her finger at him, gesturing for him to come to her. What is it? He asked as he made his way to the front of the room. Come here, she whispered, now gesturing with her whole hand. He heard several kids snicker, so he smiled. Leslie Gilroy was in his Spanish class. He didn't look at her. As he approached Mrs. Gutierrez's desk, Si, senora, he said. He had heard rumors Miss Gutierrez had once been a judge in El Salvador or Nicaragua or someplace like that, and she had to suddenly leave her home in the middle of the night to escape the Sandinistas or Contras or somebody. David, she said, you are obliged to, She struggled to find the right English words. Her bracelets jingled as she moved her hand in a circle, searching for the word. What? He asked. ¿Qué pasa? She smiled in his Spanish and continued moving her hand around in a circle. Cremalara, she said. Comprende? He shook his head. He didn't know what cremalara was. I'll try not to be late again, he said. No, she said. Cremalara is down. You need to lift up. My grades are bad, asked David. I need to raise my grades. She looked through him. Suddenly her eyes lit up and she remembered the word. Zeeper, she exclaimed. Zeeper, asked David, still not knowing what she was talking about. I need to lift up my zeeper. Suddenly he turned bright red, and as inconspicuously as possible he zipped his fly. Gracias, said Mrs. Gutierrez. The class was hysterical. He returned to his seat, trying not to look at anybody. He wondered who saw. All they would have seen were his jockey shorts. Big deal. He wondered if Leslie noticed. Of course it didn't matter whether she did or not, he realized. She'd say she did. Big deal. What did he care what Leslie or anyone else said about him? When the bell finally rang, he walked quickly out of the room, but not so quick that he'd draw any more attention to himself. Someone tapped him on the shoulder. He turned around. You and your friends think you're so cool, said Larry Clarksdale behind blue sunglasses, but at least I don't walk around with my cremalera down. David remembered how Scott and Randy had kept Larry from using the bathroom yesterday so Roger could have a smoke. And you call me a pervert, said Larry. I didn't call you a pervert, said David. Your friends did. They're not my friends, said David. They're not? No. Oh, said Larry. Well, then I think they're a bunch of assholes. David turned and headed toward his locker. As he made his way across the school, he noticed that Larry was still walking beside him. No one could really see anything, said Larry. You had your back to the class the whole time. Mrs. Gutierrez saw, said David. That doesn't count. She's from South America, said Larry. So? It's different in South America. People walk around naked down there all the time. How do you know? I used to live there in Venezuela. When I was 9 years old, I used to see naked people all the time, boys and girls, he shrugged. It was no big deal. You get used to it. You saw naked girls? Whispered David. 23, said Larry. We lived in an American section where everyone was usually dressed, but we used to go for drives, and you'd see kids walking around naked until they were like 13 or 14. Wow, David said. Larry smiled. I got pictures, too, he said. Really? David said. Not all 23, said Larry, only 12. I had to pretend to my parents that I was taking pictures of scenery and stuff, but I was really taking pictures of naked girls. David laughed. I was just a kid then, said Larry. It's no big deal to me now. You know, once you've seen 23 naked girls, it's no big deal. Yeah, David agreed, as if he had also seen 23 naked girls before. I can bring the pictures tomorrow, said Larry, if you want to see them. David shrugged. Sure, he said, as if it were no big deal, like maybe he just wanted to see the pictures because he was interested in photography. Okay, I'll bring them tomorrow. Okay, said David. Well, see you tomorrow, said Larry. Bye. Bye, David. David put his Spanish book into his locker. He didn't have any books to bring home, since he had already done all his homework. He was halfway home when it struck him. I saw Mrs. Bayfield's underpants. I really am cursed, he said aloud. Everything that happened to her keeps happening to me. That's stupid, he thought. Mrs. Bayfield didn't do anything to him. He just forgot to zip his fly after PE because he was in such a hurry. He didn't believe in witchcraft. He was, after all, going to be a scientist when he grew up. He knew that everything had a logical and scientific explanation. He didn't believe in curses or astrology or fortune cookies or any of that stuff. True, some of the same things that happened to Mrs. Bayfield happened to him, but that was just a coincidence. In a world where so many things are happening to so many people all the time, coincidences are bound to happen now and then. Okay, just one more thing, he said aloud, looking at the sky and speaking to Mrs. Bayfield or God or the devil or to whoever was in charge of curses. Just do one more bad thing to me and then I'll believe I'm cursed. He waited a few seconds for a lightning bolt to strike him or maybe a pitcher of lemonade to pour on his head. Nothing happened. He took 2 steps and stopped. He smelled something. He checked the bottom of his shoe. Sure enough, he had stepped in it. He could see it on the sidewalk behind him with his footprint right in it. He laughed. That doesn't count, he said. That's got nothing to do with Mrs. Bayfield. I've stepped in that stuff before. He looked up at the sky and shouted, I've stepped in it lots of times. And that is the end of chapter 10.